Hey everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw feathers in graphite. Now what I've done here is I've taken a section of this owl drawing and I'm going to really focus on one of the more complex feather textures to try to cover as many tips and techniques as I can. Now the first thing I like to do is use a slightly darker graphite pencil and just map in a couple of my darkest points so that I'm not working with one blank area. You can see here that I'm already hinting at where some of the main feathers are sitting. Now once I've done that, I was then using an eye makeup applicator to apply a very thin layer of graphite powder over the top, and again just hinting at where some of my main lights and darks are. Once I've done that, I'm going to come in with a lighter pencil. You can start off with something like a 2H and work your way up if needed, and then I'm just starting to map in a little bit of the feather direction. Now what this does is it enables me to follow my reference photo more accurately early on, and I'm really just focusing here on building up my values. So contrast is something that I speak about in all tutorials, regardless if it's fur or feathers. The values and contrast here are so important. So as you can see, I'm going to start to build up some slightly darker details in the feathers, and then if I want to build in my lighter highlights, I'll either leave the white of the paper showing or I'll come back in with my erasers in a moment. Now I'm going to use different erasers depending on the sort of feather texture that I'm trying to get here, but in order for the erasers to work well, the graphite has to be applied in the correct way. So as you can see, I'm using lots of multiple layers, but I'm using lighter pressure with each layer. I don't want to just jump into my darkest, softest pencils first and work with minimal layers because the depth is going to be lacking. So just like when we draw fur, I want to try to get as much depth and realism in this area of feather as I can. Now you'll see that once I'm at this stage, I'm really just breaking this up into one feather at a time. So once I've got the one layer of that feather, I'm then going to work on the one next to it and build it up slowly. Now if you like to work in whole individual layers, then of course that's absolutely fine, but if you do feel yourself getting overwhelmed at any point, it's usually an indication that we're focusing on too much of a larger area. So really try to scale that down, and if needed, as I am here, do one feather at a time. Now what this enables me to do is work through that reference photo more effectively. So I'm not able to get myself in that mindset where I'm becoming overwhelmed and stressed, which can certainly happen with textures like this. The feathers here have lots of different speckled markings, and if I try to draw all of those in at the one whole solid layer across all of that section, I find that we're going to lose that realism in the piece. So I personally just like to break it up into nice manageable chunks. So I've got a really nice foundation in here. I've broken this up into my main lights and darks, but I now need to reinforce more of my highlights. So I'm going to come in with my Tombow mono eraser and I'm starting to hint at some of those initial highlights. Now as you can see, I'm also coming back in and darkening them up because I don't need them to be bright white. Now if the graphite has been applied in the correct way, then the Tombow mono eraser is an effective and really good eraser to use for details like this. You don't have to use excessive pressure, and if you use light pressure and you're able to remove the graphite, then you know that you've applied the graphite in the correct way. If you're having a little bit more of an issue with that eraser lifting those highlights, then it could be a sign that throughout the drawing process you've been applying a little bit too much pressure to those pencils. Now the other thing that can make the erasers difficult to use or the highlights not visible is if there isn't enough graphite in place to start with. So you saw there a few moments ago that I had to come back in with a HB pencil and just darken up some of those areas, and I've then come back in with that eraser to pull the highlights in over the top. If I hadn't have darkened the layer first, then those highlights are not going to be visible. Now let's say you've allowed the white of the paper to show through, so you therefore know that that highlight is as bright as you can possibly get it, but it doesn't look as bright as you would like. That's usually an indication that you need to darken up what's next to it. If you darken up the shadows next to a highlight, you're immediately going to make that highlight appear brighter because you've reinforced your contrast. Now of course this can be applied to draw in any animal, it doesn't have to be feathers. The highlights, the shadows, and the way that they are placed and positioned is really important. The values of those highlights and shadows is what helps to build up that three-dimensional look. So if we don't have our shadows as dark as what they should be, then the whole portrait is going to look very flat. Now I have a video here on YouTube, it's my top tips for drawing realistic fur in graphite, and although of course this is feathers, the tips and techniques that I share in the fur video can be applied here. So I'll pop a link to that video in the description if it's of interest. Now as I'm starting to refine more of the details at this stage of the drawing, I'm really starting to focus on my pencil technique. Now pencil technique relies for me on three main things. So that is the direction of the pencil strokes, the thickness of the pencil strokes, and the length of the pencil strokes. Now when drawing feathers, that's going to determine how, of course, the long and wide the feathers are, but the way that they're directing and moving over the body. Now this is going to be very different depending on the sort of bird that we're drawing. The feathers of an owl are very different to those of a robin, so it's something that we need to adjust depending on the bird that we are drawing. Now the direction of the feathers, it's not random, it follows that structure underneath the feather, so the way that we need to curve those pencil strokes and move the pencil is going to help determine that realistic shape of that bird. So here you can see the top part of the wing, it needs to look like it's resting over the top side of the body. If we don't get the curve in the pencil strokes right, then we could potentially change the angle of the wing completely. So it is something to pay very close attention to. Now again, I'm coming back in here and refining more of my contrast by bringing in more of my brighter highlights. So I'm always looking to achieve good shadows and bright highlights throughout any aspect of my drawing. It's something that I'll always reinforce at different stages. Now once I was happier with the top section, I can now start working on the last feathers in this area. Now again, the same process is applying. I'm using more of my subtle graphite pencil, so maybe a HB and then a 2B, and then reinforcing the highlights from there. Because if I use my highlights right now without using my pencils first, then those highlights are not going to be as bright. Going back to what I've mentioned previously with not having enough graphite on the paper. Now if I was working with a really light subject, so let's say a yellow Labrador, you wouldn't necessarily have to have as much graphite as I'm applying here. So the amount of graphite that we need to have is going to significantly vary from animal to animal. But certainly for something like this, where the feathers had much more of a darker, more mottled effect, having more graphite, a darker graphite on that area first, and then pulling in the highlights is far easier to get that end realistic result. Now, no matter what it is that we're drawing, we do have to be paying attention to how we need to adjust what we're doing with that pencil, depending on the different textures on that animal. So for example, the feathers that I'm drawing here in this video are very different to the feathers on the face and around the eye. If I was to use exactly the same pencil technique for each, then I'm going to end up with all of my pencil strokes looking the same. So I do always have to be looking at that reference photo very closely and really paying attention to any subtle changes. If I feel that there's an area that needs to be a little bit softer, then I'll have to incorporate more of my blending and softening techniques to make sure that I've got that right balance. Now at this stage here, where this area is about 80-90% complete, I can come in and add those final details. Now what I also like to do here is zoom out of my reference photo and have a look at the rest of the drawing that I've done so far, because quite often I'll have to come in and make tiny alterations to areas that connect from one to the next. So for example, just here right now at the base of the head, those feathers I needed to reinforce more of those darker values to make it look like where it attaches to the wing and the top of the head are realistic. I don't want there to be any obvious points that I've drawn sections at different times. So I always like to make sure that I'm coming back in and reinforcing more of those details over areas that do touch from one to the next. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. And if you are interested in drawing along to the real-time step-by-step tutorial of this owl, then I'll link my Patreon in the description below. If you've got any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you'd like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. I'm going to be uploading another video next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.